After the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad, the German Wehrmacht was reeling and the Eastern Front was teetering on the brink of collapse. It was during this dire period that Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most esteemed military strategists, was called upon to devise a plan to regain the initiative against the Soviet Union. Manstein was no stranger to confrontation, not only with the enemy but also within his own ranks. His battles were as much with the Soviet forces as they were with Hitler and the German High Command. Frustrated by the Führer's strategic rigidity and overbearing influence, Manstein frequently clashed with Hitler over the best course of action. Faced with limited resources and increasing pressure, Manstein proposed an audacious plan, Operation Citadel, aimed at encircling and annihilating the Soviet forces at Kursk. However, his vision was met with skepticism and hesitation from Hitler and his advisors. Manstein's insistence on a swift and decisive strike contrasted sharply with Hitler's obsession with micromanagement and delays. In this video, we will delve into the intricacies of these internal conflicts, Manstein's strategic alternatives, and the enormous stakes involved. We'll examine how his plans could have potentially altered the war's trajectory and why they ultimately faltered. The Battle of Kursk was not just a clash of armies, but a collision of ideologies and egos within the German High Command leadership, and most detrimentally, there was a spy involved. At dawn on Monday, July 12, 1943, SS Sturmbannführer Christian Bachmann, the Panzer Group commander of the 3rd SS Panzer Grenadier Division, directed his troops to traverse the Pesel River and launch an offensive. The German forces advanced northward towards the east-west route linking the towns of Kartashevka and Prokhorovka. After battling through multiple Soviet defensive positions and advancing nearly 5 miles, the Panzer Group reached the road around midnight. The following day's strategy involved attacking the rear of the Soviet forces defending the town of Prokhorovka, situated just 3 miles to the east. Success would result in the death or surrender of thousands of Soviet soldiers, marking a pivotal moment in Operation Citadel. Could a final decisive German assault on Prokhorovka dismantle the extensive Soviet defences? The assault on the Kartashevka-Prokhorovka road had exacted a heavy toll on Bachmann's Panzer Group, resulting in the loss or damage of 45 tanks, nearly half of its total strength. Faced with sheer exhaustion, increasing personnel losses, and the influx of substantial Soviet reinforcements, the Panzer Group could advance no further. In reality, all German forces involved in the offensive faced the same predicament. Operation Citadel had been halted. The Kartashevka-Prokhorovka road marked the furthest advance the Germans achieved towards Kursk, signifying the final effort of the last major German summer offensive on the Russian front during World War II. The encirclement of the German 6th Army at Stalingrad concluded on February 2, 1943, resulting in the annihilation of over 20 German divisions and significant portions of the Romanian, Hungarian and Italian forces guarding the 6th Army's flanks. The devastating loss of nearly 225,000 men at Stalingrad severely weakened the Germans, leaving them ill-equipped to counter the Soviet efforts to encircle the remaining forces of Army Group South. Should the Soviets succeed, the German army would face a decisive defeat on the Russian front. The responsibility of halting the Soviet advance and re-establishing the front fell to Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, a renowned expert in mobile tank warfare, often regarded as the finest German general of World War II. On February 17th, Adolf Hitler travelled to Manstein's headquarters near Zaporozhye on the Dnieper River to address the dire situation facing Army Group South. Consistent with his increasingly hands-on approach, Hitler ordered that there would be no further retreats and that the German soldiers must hold their ground at all cost. Recognizing that such an order would lead to the annihilation of the German armies in southern Russia, Manstein argued fervently with Hitler. Ultimately, Manstein persuaded Hitler to revoke the no-retreat directive and grant operational autonomy to the forces under his command. The proximity of a Soviet armoured unit, just 25 miles from Hitler's location, likely also influenced the decision. Manstein promptly implemented a strategy to mislead the Soviets into believing that the German army was retreating to the Dnieper River. Convinced that a decisive victory was imminent, the Soviets pushed their forces to the point of exhaustion and extended their supply lines too far. German decryption of Soviet operational codes had informed Manstein of their precarious situation. Seizing this opportunity, he launched his panzer divisions in a concentrated attack on the vulnerable Soviet flanks. The plan, later known as Manstein's counterstroke, proved highly successful, achieving its objectives. Kharkov, Russia's fourth largest city, was recaptured, and the Soviet offensive was halted with substantial losses. However, the onset of the rainy season in March turned much of southern Russia into a vast expanse of mud, making motorized movement nearly impossible. This exhaustion and the mud brought the German counteroffensive to a halt, providing respite for the battered Soviets. For the Germans, the unintended consequence of this victory was the creation of a salient in the front line, 120 miles wide at its base, centered around the town of Kursk. Within the Kursk salient, 9 Soviet infantry armies and 2 tank armies were at risk. If the Germans succeeded, any Soviet offensive action planned for the remainder of 1943 would likely be postponed or cancelled. Such a victory would enable the German army in the east to regroup and redeploy units to the Mediterranean or France, preparing for the anticipated Allied amphibious landings. The German strategy involved a classic pincer movement targeting the base of the bulge, with the 9th Army from Army Group Centre attacking from the north and the 4th Panzer Army from Army Group South advancing from the south. The objective was for these armies to converge at the town of Kursk, effectively encircling and trapping the Soviet forces within the salient. Despite Manstein's concerns about repeated delays, Operation Citadel finally commenced on the afternoon of July 4, 1943. Initial attacks were carried out by the 48th Panzer Corps of the 4th Panzer Army to secure artillery observation posts in preparation for the full-scale offensive the following day. The 9th Army and the remainder of the 4th Panzer Army launched their offensive on July 5th. After several days of intense fighting, the German advance stalled near the towns of Teploye and Poniri. Despite repeated assaults, the infantry divisions were unable to create the crucial breach in the Soviet defences, facing fierce resistance and well-prepared defensive positions.
The dawn broke with an unsettling quietness, a prelude to the storm that was to come. Part of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, we were acutely aware that the battle was to be a monumental clash. Intelligence had reported the Soviet fortifications were deep and extensive. Yet, our orders were clear. Break through the defenses and encircle the Red Army. I adjusted my Stahlhelm and checked my Karabiner 98K, ensuring everything was in place. We were well equipped, our division being one of the elite units. But the weight of our task was heavy. We moved out with our Tiger tanks and light armor leading the advance, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. The air was filled with smoke and burning metal. The Soviet T-34s had proved to be formidable adversaries. One of the largest tank battles in history was unfolding. We were thrown into the heart of it, our Tiger tanks attempting to break the Soviet lines. I can still hear the deafening roars of the tank guns, the clanking of tracks, and the cries of wounded comrades. The battlefield was a chaotic inferno. Despite our superior equipment, the sheer numbers of Soviet forces began to take their toll. Waves of T-34s crashed against our lines, and the Luftwaffe struggled to maintain air superiority. The order to retreat came as a shock. It was a bitter pill to swallow, acknowledging that our offensive had stalled. We were pushed back by the relentless Soviet counterattacks. Our unit, diminished and weary, began a fighting withdrawal. The Soviets were unyielding, their artillery relentless. We moved through the bombed-out remnants of villages. Fields turned to mud by the constant shelling. The retreat was grueling, our morale low, but our discipline holding. The Obersturmführer barked orders, ensuring we maintained formation and covered our flanks. The retreat led us to establish a defensive line near Orel. Trenches were dug, machine gun nests fortified, and we prepared for the Soviet advance. Supplies were scarce, and the days were filled with the constant din of artillery. We established a temporary position near Bryansk. We received reinforcements and resupplies, but it was clear that this was a holding action at best.
The panzer divisions, including the formidable Tiger and Panther tanks, became entangled in the dense minefields, anti-tank obstacles and artillery fire of the Soviet defensive belts. Heavy fighting ensued, with both sides suffering significant casualties. The German forces launched numerous attacks, supported by airstrikes and artillery barrages, but the Soviets held their ground with a combination of well-coordinated counterattacks and effective use of anti-tank weapons. The battle at Ponyri Station, in particular, turned into a brutal close-quarters engagement, earning the area the grim nickname Little Stalingrad due to the intensity of the combat. On July 12th, as the 9th Army committed its last reserves to the offensive, the Soviets launched Operation Kutuzov, targeting the rear of the 9th Army north and east of Orel. This counteroffensive involved several Soviet armies, which rapidly advanced, exploiting the weakened German positions. The Soviet forces aimed to encircle and destroy the German 9th Army, forcing the Germans to halt further operations. Faced with the threat of encirclement and the depletion of their reserves, the German High Command ordered a withdrawal. Consequently, Operation Citadel came to an end for the 9th Army after an advance of only about 10 miles towards Kursk. In the south, the 4th Panzer Army launched its offensive with its formidable panzer divisions, achieving greater initial success. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps performed exceptionally well, spearheading the attack with a series of rapid and devastating assaults that penetrated deep into Soviet territory. However, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps faced significant challenges due to the inability of the 3rd Panzer Corps and the 48th Panzer Corps to adequately protect its flanks, which were crucial for maintaining momentum and securing their advances. Positioned on the eastern flank of the SS formations, the 3rd Panzer Corps began the offensive by attempting to cross the heavily defended Donets River. The strong Soviet defences, comprising entrenched infantry, anti-tank guns and fortified positions, delayed this crossing, preventing the 3rd Panzer Corps from keeping pace with the rapid advance of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. This disparity in progress created a gap that exposed the flanks of the leading elements to Soviet counterattacks. Despite these challenges, the 3rd Panzer Corps executed a daring and successful surprise attack on the night of July 11th, using captured Soviet T-34 tanks to infiltrate enemy lines. This clever tactic temporarily disoriented the Soviet defenders and achieved a localized breakthrough. However, the 3rd Panzer Corps continued to lag behind, hampered by the robust Soviet defense and logistical difficulties. The 48th Panzer Corps, tasked with securing the western flank, also struggled to advance due to similar issues with entrenched Soviet defenses and fierce resistance. These delays and the inability to maintain a coherent and protected front line hindered the overall effectiveness of the 4th Panzer Army's offensive. The initial successes of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, while impressive, were not sustainable without adequate support from the neighbouring corps. The disjointed progress and the increasing Soviet counterattacks eventually forced the German forces to reassess their positions and halt their advance. The inability to secure the flanks and the lagging support from the 3rd and 48th Panzer Corps underscored the challenges faced by the 4th Panzer Army in their southern offensive. The 48th Panzer Corps, despite including the elite Grossdeutschland Panzer Division with over 300 tanks, encountered difficulties from the outset. Ineffective tank tactics, adverse weather conditions and misfortune plagued their efforts. Heavy rains turned roads into quagmires, severely hampering mobility and coordination. Moreover, the dense Soviet minefields and well-camouflaged anti-tank positions inflicted significant losses. These factors prevented the 48th Panzer Corps from securing the western flank of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. As a result, the SS Panzer divisions were forced to allocate resources to protect their exposed flank, diverting crucial strength away from their primary objective of driving northward for a swift, decisive breakthrough towards Kursk. This diversion ultimately slowed their advance and compromised the overall effectiveness of the offensive. On July 12th, the final phase of Operation Citadel commenced with the arrival of the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army and several attached corps. These fresh Red Army units launched an assault on the Tacon SS Panzer Corps with nearly 850 tanks. Out of these, 520 tanks targeted a corridor between the Pisel River and Prokhorovka, defended by the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. Additionally, 240 Soviet tanks were committed against the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, positioned southwest of Prokhorovka. The Soviet tank formations attempted to close the distance quickly between themselves and the German tanks to counteract the superior firepower and range of the German tank guns. However, this tactic led to a disastrous outcome for the Soviets. In total, the Soviets lost approximately 650 tanks to the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmistrov, commander of the 5th Guards Tank Army, reported that 400 tanks were lost just in the Prokhorovka area. In contrast, the 3 divisions of the 2 SS Panzer Corps lost a total of only 62 tanks. Contrary to many published works, Soviet propaganda and early Soviet battle reports, the tank battle at Prokhorovka was not the death ride of the panzers, with hundreds of German tanks being destroyed. Thorough research of German battle reports and post-war admissions by Soviet generals clearly indicates that, both tactically and numerically, the Germans won the tank battle at Prokhorovka on July 12th. German forces, primarily the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, managed to inflict severe losses on the Soviet armoured units, destroying numerous Soviet tanks while sustaining relatively lower casualties themselves. This victory, however, came at a high cost. Despite the tactical success at Prokhorovka, the 4th Panzer Army failed to regain its momentum after this engagement, having advanced nearly 35 miles since July 4th. The German divisions were exhausted after 8 consecutive days of intense fighting. They faced significant attrition, with dwindling supplies, few replacements, and no reinforcements to bolster their ranks. The harsh conditions of the Eastern Front, coupled with the relentless Soviet resistance, further sapped the German forces' strength and morale. The Soviets, despite suffering significant tank losses at Prokhorovka, achieved their ultimate goal of halting the German offensive. The Soviet High Command had meticulously planned and executed a strategy of deep defensive belts, utilizing natural terrain advantages and a well-coordinated series of counterattacks. These tactics wore down the attacking German units and blunted their spearheads. The arrival of Soviet reserves and the execution of Operation Kutuzov further compounded the Germans' difficulties, forcing them onto the defensive. The 2 primary reasons for the German defeat were the lack of surprise and the overwhelming number of men and equipment available to the defenders. Before Operation Citadel began, the Soviets received excellent intelligence from British sources and their own spy network in Germany and Switzerland. British intelligence indirectly shared its intercepts from the German Enigma coding machine, providing the Soviets with advanced knowledge of the German plans. This intelligence allowed the Soviets to anticipate the timing and direction of the German offensive, giving them a crucial advantage in preparing their defences. Additionally, the Soviets had a spy known as Werther, who revealed the starting date of Operation Citadel and the locations of the German attacks. The identity of Werther remains unknown to this day, but speculation points to figures such as Hitler's personal secretary Martin Bormann, the chief of German intelligence, the Abwehr, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, or a high-ranking officer in the communications section at Hitler's headquarters. This insider information was instrumental in allowing the Soviet High Command to strategically deploy their forces, reinforce key positions, and set up extensive defensive belts that the Germans would struggle to breach. The Soviet preparation was meticulous and comprehensive. They constructed multiple lines of defense, laid extensive minefields, and positioned anti-tank guns and artillery in strategic locations. The Red Army amassed a vast number of troops and tanks, significantly outnumbering the German attackers. The Soviet Air Force was also well prepared, ready to counter the Luftwaffe and support ground operations. This overwhelming superiority in men and material ensured that the Soviets could absorb the initial German attacks and then launch effective counter-offensive. The lack of surprise and the well-prepared Soviet defences nullified the initial advantages of the German blitzkrieg tactics. The Germans, who had hoped for a quick and decisive breakthrough, found themselves bogged down in a protracted and costly battle. Their forces were unable to maintain the momentum needed to penetrate the deep Soviet defences, leading to high casualties and significant equipment losses. Whoever Werther was, they had immediate access to the German High Command, as much of the information passed to the Soviets was timely, sometimes arriving just a day after the Germans issued orders. This level of access indicates that Werther was deeply embedded within Hitler's inner circle, or at least somewhere within the upper echelons of the German command structure. Interestingly, most of the command decisions during Manstein's counterstroke originated from Manstein's headquarters rather than Hitler's. This further supports the theory that a spy was operating at a high level within the German military hierarchy. The rapid transmission of crucial information allowed the Soviets to respond swiftly and effectively to German movements and strategies. Werther's intelligence was so precise and timely that it often seemed as if the Soviets were reading the German playbook in real time. This constant flow of information was invaluable to the Soviet commanders, who could adjust their plans and reinforce their positions based on the latest German directives. Additionally, it is reasonable to assume that because orders during the German counter-offensive came from Manstein's headquarters, the Soviets were misled into believing that the Germans were in full retreat rather than preparing for a counter-offensive. This misperception could have been deliberately fostered by the Germans to set a trap, but it also highlights the potential for miscommunication and confusion within the German ranks. The Soviets, acting on the intelligence provided by Werther, might have underestimated the threat posed by Manstein's forces, leading to strategic missteps. The presence of a high-level spy such as Werther had profound implications for the German war effort. Even after 2 years of devastating battlefield losses, the Soviets still possessed substantial reserves that could be deployed to exhaust the Germans. This remarkable resilience was a testament to the Soviet Union's vast human and material resources, as well as their ability to quickly mobilize and replace losses. Following the commitment of the 5th Guards Tank Army from the steppe front, the Soviets retained an impressive array of forces in reserve. These reserves included 4 infantry armies, 3 cavalry corps and 3 mechanized corps, totaling nearly 950 tanks and approximately 350,000 men. This formidable reserve force was strategically positioned to respond to any potential breakthroughs by the Germans. The depth and breadth of the Soviet reserves ensured that even if the 4th Panzer Army had managed to break through in the south, it would still have faced overwhelming opposition. The Soviet High Command, well aware of the Germans' offensive capabilities, had meticulously planned for such contingencies. The reserves could be swiftly deployed to plug any gaps in the front lines, launch counterattacks, and encircle overextended German units. The presence of these substantial reserves not only bolstered the Soviet defensive efforts, but also provided a psychological edge. German commanders, aware of the Soviet capacity for rapid reinforcement, had to contend with the constant threat of being overwhelmed by fresh Soviet troops. This strategic depth allowed the Soviets to absorb and recover from initial setbacks, gradually wearing down the attacking German forces through attrition. The ability to maintain and deploy such large reserves despite previous losses was a critical factor in the overall Soviet strategy. It exemplified the Soviet Union's industrial might and logistical efficiency, which enabled them to sustain prolonged and intensive combat operations. The reserve's sheer size and readiness underscored the futility of the German attempts to achieve a quick and decisive victory on the Eastern Front. The Soviet advantage in reserves was stark when compared to the German reserves. The 24th Panzer Corps had 3 understrength panzer divisions, of which only 2 were available for Operation Citadel. These 2 divisions, the 23rd Panzer Division and the elite SS Viking Division, had a combined total of 97 tanks and 12,000 men. Despite their elite status and combat experience, they only began moving to the battlefield on July 12th, well into the critical phases of the operation. The delayed movement and limited strength of these units significantly reduced their potential impact on the ongoing battle. The 3rd Division of the 24th Panzer Corps remained engaged in combat operations with the 1st Panzer Army to the south, unable to join the efforts at Kursk. This dispersal of forces highlighted the strategic overstretch faced by the Germans as they were compelled to divide their already insufficient resources across multiple fronts. In stark contrast, the Soviets maintained a substantial and well-prepared reserve force. Their ability to rapidly mobilize and deploy these reserves was a key factor in their defensive strategy. The inability to match the Soviet reserves and the failure to achieve a quick breakthrough doomed Operation Citadel. The Germans' hopes for a decisive victory at Kursk were dashed as they faced not only the formidable Soviet defences, but also the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Soviet reserves. The stark contrast in reserve capabilities was a crucial factor in the outcome of the battle, demonstrating the effectiveness of Soviet strategic planning and the resilience of their military forces. In February 1943, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein presented two operational proposals for the upcoming summer campaign. The first, known as the Forehand Proposal, involved the Germans launching a limited offensive immediately after the rainy season concluded. The objective of this plan was to incapacitate the Soviets sufficiently to prevent them from undertaking major offensive operations for the remainder of the summer. Manstein's strategy aimed to exploit the temporary weaknesses in the Soviet lines, striking quickly and decisively to disrupt their preparations and logistical networks. The Forehand Proposal capitalized on the element of surprise and the temporary lull in Soviet operations caused by the muddy spring conditions, known as the Rasputitsa, which rendered large-scale movements difficult. By initiating an offensive at the earliest possible moment after the rains, the Germans hoped to catch the Soviets off guard, dealing a significant blow before they could fully recover from the winter's attrition and fortify their positions. Manstein envisioned concentrating the available panzer divisions and mechanized units to achieve a rapid breakthrough, followed by deep penetration into Soviet-held territory. The goal was to destroy key Soviet formations and infrastructure, thereby delaying or disrupting their ability to launch counteroffensives. This approach aimed not only to gain territorial advantage, but also to weaken Soviet morale and operational capacity. However, the Forehand Proposal was not without its risks. Launching an offensive immediately after the rainy season meant operating in potentially treacherous terrain, with mud and residual water impeding the movement of troops and vehicles. Moreover, the German forces, still recovering from the brutal winter battles and stretched thin across multiple fronts, would need to be meticulously coordinated to achieve the desired swift and decisive results. Despite these challenges, Manstein believed that the Forehand Proposal offered the best chance to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. By preempting Soviet plans and seizing the moment of relative weakness, the Germans could potentially stabilize the front lines and buy valuable time to reinforce and regroup their forces for subsequent operations. The second option, known as the Backhand Proposal, involved allowing the Soviets to launch their major summer offensive and then leveraging the superiority of the German panzer forces to strike at the enemy flanks and encircle the attackers. This strategy required highly mobile operations and the willingness to relinquish large swaths of captured Soviet territory to set up favourable conditions for a counter-encirclement. Manstein believed that this approach would exploit the overextension of Soviet forces, creating opportunities for decisive counterattacks that could lead to significant Soviet losses and a stabilization of the front. The Backhand Proposal capitalized on the tactical flexibility and superior mobility of the German panzer divisions. By drawing the Soviets into a deep offensive, the Germans could identify weak points in the Soviet advance and concentrate their armoured forces to deliver powerful flank attacks. The goal was to trap and annihilate Soviet spearheads, thereby neutralizing their offensive capability and regaining the strategic initiative. However, the idea of ceding any captured territory was entirely contrary to Hitler's wishes. Hitler's strategic mindset was firmly rooted in holding and defending every inch of conquered land, viewing any withdrawal as an admission of weakness and a blow to German prestige. This rigid stance on territorial retention ultimately doomed the Backhand Proposal from the start, despite its potential for a more flexible and dynamic defence. After further discussions and the successful German counteroffensive in March, which bolstered confidence in the Wehrmacht's offensive capabilities, the Forehand Proposal was adopted. This plan was eventually formalised and became known as Operation Citadel. The decision to proceed with the Forehand Proposal reflected a compromise between the operational realities of the Eastern Front and the strategic preferences of the German High Command, particularly Hitler. Operation Citadel aimed to deliver a decisive blow to the Soviet forces by attacking the Kursk salient from the north and south, with the goal of encircling and destroying a significant portion of the Red Army. The plan required a massive concentration of German armoured and infantry divisions, supported by air power, to achieve a breakthrough and exploit the anticipated weaknesses in the Soviet defences. Operation Citadel aimed to deliver a decisive blow to the Soviet forces by attacking the Kursk salient from the north and south, with the goal of encircling and destroying a significant portion of the Red Army. The plan required a massive concentration of German armoured and infantry divisions supported by air power to achieve a breakthrough and exploit the anticipated weaknesses in the Soviet defences. Two other operations, known as Habicht and Panther, were also considered as precursors to Operation Citadel. Their objective was to eliminate a salient in the front line near Izium, which posed a threat to the industrial complex near Kharkov. These operations were designed to straighten the front lines and secure critical industrial areas, thereby reducing the pressure on German forces in the region. Hitler seriously contemplated these operations, recognizing their potential to stabilize the front and protect valuable resources. However, after careful consideration, Hitler ultimately dismissed Habicht and Panther in favor of launching the single, larger Operation Citadel. This decision was driven by a desire for a more decisive and impactful offensive that could potentially deliver a crippling blow to the Soviet forces, while Habicht and Panther would have been conducted on a smaller scale than Citadel and were unlikely to have significantly altered the overall course of the war on the Russian front. Their outcomes could have influenced the decision to proceed with Citadel. Had Habicht and Panther been executed, their success or failure might have provided valuable insights and momentum that could have impacted the strategic planning for Citadel. Successful operations might have bolstered German confidence and demonstrated the viability of further offensive actions. Conversely, any setbacks or failures in these smaller operations could have highlighted the challenges and risks associated with launching a larger scale offensive, potentially leading to a re-evaluation of the feasibility of Operation Citadel. Another operation briefly discussed was the elimination of the Kursk salient by attacking it head-on near the town of Relsk. This plan involved German forces capturing Kursk and then spreading north and south to encircle the remaining Soviet forces within the Bulge. The idea was to cut off and destroy a significant portion of the Red Army by pinching off the salient from both flanks, thereby achieving a decisive victory. However, several critical factors rendered this variation of the offensive impractical and strategically unsound. The road network and terrain around Rilsk were unsuitable for moving large numbers of troops and heavy equipment. The area was characterized by rough, hilly terrain and limited infrastructure, which would severely hamper the mobility of the German panzer and mechanized divisions. The logistical challenges posed by the difficult terrain would have complicated the rapid and coordinated movements required for a successful encirclement, increasing the risk of delays and exposing the attacking forces to Soviet counterattacks. Furthermore, this approach offered little strategic advantage over other proposed operations. The Germans would still have to confront the same formidable defensive belts meticulously prepared by the Soviets. These defences included multiple lines of trenches, minefields, anti-tank obstacles, and well-positioned artillery designed to absorb and blunt the initial German assaults. In addition to these defensive fortifications, the Germans would also face substantial Soviet reserves, ready to be deployed to reinforce the front and launch counter-offensive. The plan to attack near Rilsk did not offer a solution to the fundamental challenges of breaking through the heavily fortified Soviet lines and dealing with the significant numerical superiority of the Red Army. It was recognized that even if the initial attack succeeded in capturing Kursk, the subsequent encirclement maneuvers would likely stall against the reinforced Soviet positions, leading to a protracted and costly battle with no guaranteed strategic benefit. Any hope of winning the war against the Soviet Union was effectively lost at Stalingrad. However, in July 1943, the German army still had the potential to inflict significant losses on the Soviets if properly led. The question remains whether all other factors could have aligned to alter the outcome of the war with Russia, leading to something other than total defeat. For instance, better strategic decisions, more effective use of intelligence, timely reinforcements, and improved logistical support might have enabled the Germans to sustain their offensive capabilities longer. Better strategic decisions could have included more flexible and adaptive planning, such as considering alternative operations like Manstein's backhand proposal, or earlier, smaller offensives like Habicht and Panther. Effective use of intelligence, such as fully exploiting the information from the Enigma intercepts and countering Soviet espionage, could have provided the Germans with a better understanding of Soviet intentions and capabilities. Timely reinforcements and improved logistical support might have alleviated the chronic shortages of men and material that plagued the German war effort, enabling more sustained and coordinated operations. Additionally, internal Soviet issues such as political instability, logistical problems or morale issues within the Red Army could have weakened the Soviet war effort, creating opportunities for German successes. Changes in Allied support dynamics, such as a delay in the opening of the Western Front or reduced Lend-Lease supplies, might have lessened the pressure on Germany, allowing them to concentrate more resources on the Eastern Front. Nonetheless, given the overwhelming Soviet manpower and resources, along with the Allies' relentless pressure on multiple fronts, it is highly improbable that the ultimate outcome could have been fundamentally changed. The Soviet Union's ability to replace losses and deploy massive reserves, as demonstrated during the Battle of Kursk, coupled with the continuous Allied bombing campaign and the eventual invasion of Western Europe, created a multi-front challenge that the German military was increasingly incapable of meeting. The Germans faced insurmountable odds as they contended with the industrial might and vast human resources of the Soviet Union, the strategic bombing campaigns that crippled their production capabilities, and the Allied advances in North Africa, Italy, and eventually France. Even with perfect execution of military strategies and optimal use of intelligence and logistics, the cumulative weight of the Allied and Soviet efforts would have likely led to the same ultimate conclusion. The Germans were unable to recover from the significant losses suffered during the previous 2 years of campaigning. While Soviet resources appeared inexhaustible, Soviet industrial output far surpassed that of the German war industry, and the Germans faced a substantial manpower disadvantage even after the severe Soviet losses from prior battles. The relentless Soviet war effort was bolstered by a vast and well-coordinated industrial base that could replace losses with remarkable speed. For instance, in August 1943, the 5th Guards Tank Army and the 1st Tank Army lost nearly 800 of their initial 1,000 tanks in a series of battles near Bogodukov. Despite these heavy losses, the Soviets managed to replace them within a month, underscoring their immense production capacity and logistical efficiency. This starkly highlighted the Soviet advantage in tanks, aircraft, artillery, and manpower, an advantage that only grew as the war progressed. The Red Army's ability to rapidly replenish its ranks and equipment ensured that it could sustain prolonged offensives and recover quickly from setbacks. In contrast, the German war machine, already stretched thin, struggled to keep up with the relentless pace of the conflict. German industry, hampered by Allied bombing campaigns and resource shortages, could not match the scale of Soviet production. The situation became even more dire for the Germans after the Western Allies landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944. The opening of a second front in Western Europe stretched German resources and attention even further, forcing them to fight a two-front war that they were ill-equipped to sustain. The sheer scale of Soviet forces meant that the Germans could only hope to compete through superior strategy and tactics. However, even with tactical brilliance, the disparity in resources and reinforcements increasingly tipped the balance in favour of the Soviets. The Germans executed several skillful defensive operations and counterattacks, showcasing their tactical expertise. Yet, these efforts could not compensate for the overwhelming Soviet numerical and material superiority. The constant influx of fresh Soviet troops and equipment ensured that the Red Army could maintain pressure on the German front lines, gradually wearing down their resistance. Additionally, the Allies' strategic bombing campaigns crippled German industrial capacity, targeting key factories, transportation networks, and supply depots. This further exacerbated the German logistical challenges, making it increasingly difficult to equip and reinforce their frontline units. The cumulative effect of these factors left the Germans with little chance of altering the overall outcome of the war. The outcome of Operation Citadel might suggest that Manstein's backhand proposal could have been more successful. This approach, supported by Manstein and General Heinz Guderian, an authority on tank warfare and then serving as Inspector General of Panzer troops, would have mirrored the successful March counteroffensive on a larger scale. The backhand proposal leveraged the German panzer forces' superiority in mobile operations and tactics. For it to have had any chance of altering the course of the war against Russia, the Germans needed to inflict substantial losses on the Soviets and execute this plan without interference from Hitler and his spy-infested headquarters. A successful backhand strategy would have required the Germans to allow the Soviets to advance into a salient, creating an opportunity for a counter-offensive that could encircle and destroy significant Soviet forces. This strategy capitalized on the German strengths in maneuver warfare, utilizing their well-trained panzer divisions to strike at the flanks and rear of the Soviet forces, thereby trapping them in a pocket. The element of surprise, coupled with the tactical flexibility of the German armoured units, could have resulted in a devastating blow to the Soviet offensive. Furthermore, this strategy would have involved an orderly retreat to shorter and more defensible positions along the Dnieper River. By consolidating their forces and establishing strong defensive lines, the Germans could have created a more manageable and fortified front. This would have allowed them to better utilize their limited resources, focusing on mobile defenses and counterattacks to repel Soviet advances. Such a defensive posture could have conserved German manpower and equipment, preventing the kind of attritional losses that they suffered in static defensive battles like those at Kursk. However, for the backhand proposal to be successful, it was crucial that Hitler and his high command refrain from interfering with the operational planning and execution. Hitler's tendency to micromanage and his insistence on holding territory at all costs often led to strategic inflexibility and missed opportunities. Moreover, the presence of spies within the German headquarters compromised operational security, potentially leaking critical plans to the Soviets and undermining the effectiveness of German strategies. Despite these challenges, a well-executed backhand strategy could have significantly delayed the Soviet advance and altered the strategic landscape of the Eastern Front. While it might not have led to ultimate victory, given the overwhelming Soviet resources and the relentless pressure from the Western Allies, it could have prolonged the war against Russia. This delay could have had several potential implications, such as buying time for the development of new German weapons, creating opportunities for political negotiations, or diverting Soviet resources from other critical fronts. In January 1943, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and President Franklin D. Roosevelt met at Casablanca in North Africa and agreed that the Axis powers must accept unconditional surrender. Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, who did not attend the Casablanca summit, initially expressed his displeasure, but ultimately adhered to this policy for the remainder of the war. However, this agreement was made among uneasy allies. Roosevelt feared that Stalin might negotiate a separate peace with the Germans, potentially leaving the Western Allies to confront the full might of the German war machine alone. Churchill, on the other hand, was not fully in favour of the unconditional surrender policy, as it eliminated any possibility of negotiating with the Germans to prevent Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe. Stalin, always suspicious of the Western Allies, believed they harboured ulterior motives against Russia. His distrust was rooted in a long history of ideological and geopolitical tensions, and the alliance was more a matter of necessity than genuine camaraderie. Following the German defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943, Stalin even hinted that peace negotiations with Germany might be possible if Hitler and his Nazi regime were overthrown. This suggestion underscored the fragile and complex nature of the alliance, with each leader wary of the other's intentions and the potential for shifting allegiances. The policy of unconditional surrender had significant implications for the conduct and conclusion of the war. For Roosevelt, it was a means to ensure total victory and prevent any remnants of the Axis powers from claiming they were not fully defeated, which could lead to future conflicts. For Churchill, it was a more complex issue. He understood the need for a decisive end to the war, but was also deeply concerned about the post-war balance of power. The insistence on unconditional surrender left no room for manoeuvring to counter Soviet influence in Eastern Europe, a region of strategic importance to the British Empire. The uneasy alliance was further complicated by the vastly different war experiences and goals of the Allies. The Soviets, having borne the brunt of the fighting on the Eastern Front, were determined to secure their western borders and establish a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. The Western Allies, while committed to defeating Nazi Germany, were also focused on limiting Soviet expansion and ensuring a post-war order that favoured democratic and capitalist systems. Roosevelt's fear of a separate Soviet-German peace was not unfounded. The spectre of a sudden shift in alliances haunted the strategic planning of the Western Allies. Stalin's occasional overtures towards peace with Germany were likely tactical, intended to keep his options open and exert pressure on his allies. The Casablanca Declaration thus served as a binding commitment that aimed to solidify the alliance against any potential fractures, but also locked the Allies into a path that precluded negotiated settlements with the Axis powers. A significant German victory in Russia during 1943, combined with peace feelers initiated with Russia in late 1942, might have persuaded Stalin to consider a separate peace. While many factors would have needed to align for this to happen, the potential existed for an outcome other than a total German defeat in Russia. Such a victory could have bolstered German morale and weakened Soviet resolve, possibly leading to negotiations. A separate peace with the Soviets would have allowed Germany to redirect its resources and focus on the Western Allies, potentially altering the broader strategic landscape of the World War II. However, the realization of this scenario would have required exceptional military success, strategic acumen, and favorable diplomatic conditions, all of which were highly challenging under the circumstances. Kursk was Germany's last major strategic offensive in World War II. Following this battle, the German military was no longer capable of mounting large-scale, high-stakes offensives due to the enormous losses in men and equipment. The failure at Kursk significantly weakened the Wehrmacht's ability to conduct major operations, and the Germans were forced onto the defensive for the rest of the war. Subsequent battles and operations, while still fierce, were smaller in scale and scope, lacking the strategic ambition and extensive resources deployed at Kursk to gain the initiative in 1943, or was Stalingrad the true defeat of the German war machine? Also, who was the spy? Although there isn't a definitive answer, the idea of someone major leaking all the plans is astounding. Who do you think it could have been? It sure is baffling. This brings us to the end of the video. I hope you learned something new today. I'm very grateful to have you on this journey with me, and I truly appreciate each and every one of you. If you enjoyed the video, please be sure to like and subscribe. A big thank you to my patrons for their support. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Goodbye for now.